All right. Well, on to our next talk. Here we have Don McCrady. He works at Polyverse. And Don McCrady is the principal engineering manager of the compiler team over there. And Don began his career working on compilers at IBM Canada. He then spent 17 years working at Microsoft on a variety of teams, ranging from Windows to the parallel computing team and the Xbox commercial services team. He spent 5 years as a senior engineering manager at Tableau Software before joining Polyverse. And now he'll be talking about blind ROP attacks.
Okay, can everybody hear me okay?
Yeah, loud and clear.
All right, and you can see my screen, which says Blind ROP, Anatomy of a Brute Force Attack.
Yep.
All right, thanks for that intro. That's pretty accurate. So I'm going to be talking about blind ROP. ROP, of course, is return-oriented programming, and blind is a way to do that without foreknowledge. Since I've already gotten an introduction for me, I will just move on. I work at a small startup called Polyverse, which has been around since 2015. I've been there for about 1.5 years. And, I think this is actually a good segue into, what's the difference between standard ROP and blind ROP. Standard ROP, it relies on the fact that there is everybody that's running the same version of Linux out there is running the exact same bits of Linux. And what I really mean by that is if you do a binary diff of somebody else's version of CentOS 7.9 and your copy of CentOS 7.9, it'll be identical. Polyverse actually scrambles things. So even though you might be running the same version and build of an operating system, if you're running a Polyverse version of it, things will be laid out a little bit differently. So if you recall, a standard ROP attack is going to go something like this. I've identified a potential victim out there, and I know they're running, a particular build of Linux, a particular version and build of Linux, and a piece of server software that I also know the exact version and build of, and I'm going to clone that on my local machine. And I'm going to carefully construct my ROP payload to reuse gadgets that are known to be in the address space of the thing that I'm attacking. So if there's a useful gadget at address 1234 on my machine, it's reasonable to assume that it might be at address 1234 on the victim's machine too. So once I've carefully found out all the locations of my gadgets, I have high confidence that when I can successfully attack my own system, I can run it against the actual victim system and it'll work. Blind ROP is a little bit different. Blind ROP, you don't know ahead of time where things are located in the victim's binary. So this was all introduced back in 2009 in this really good paper called Hacking Blind. And I have a slide at the end of this deck, which has links, and this is the first link on that slide. Everything that I'm going to talk about and demo to you today is based on this paper. It's based on their work. So, I want to give them all the credit that they deserve. This is all based on their work. So in a blind ROP, the attacker knows almost nothing about the vulnerable target. He knows that it has a vulnerability, and he knows that it could be exploited. And you can also use open source inspection to make good educated guesses about where things are, and that could speed things up. But in general, you don't really need to know much about the vulnerable target. The attack is a trial and error attack, where each success and each failure gives you a little bit more information about the victim software, and after enough trial and error requests, you'll have enough that you can build a custom payload and transmit it to the vulnerable system and take it over. In other words, it basically uses crash and no crash signals. My connection got cut off, therefore crashed. I've learned something along the way. So what I'm going to be demoing and talking about is a blind ROP attack against an old vulnerable version of nginx, version 1.4.0. And I want to stress, can't stress enough that nginx has fixed this. So it's not vulnerable anymore, or this particular vulnerability doesn't exist, and it hasn't existed in nginx for a long time. But we resurrected this version of nginx without that patch, and we're able to exploit it using Blind ROP. So I'm going to actually demo this twice, and I'm just going to very quickly go through it the first time, and then the rest of the talk I'm going to break down each step, and I'll show you each step execute again. So the nginx is version 1.4, as I said. The attack script is written in Ruby and is what runs the blind attack. And at the end, when we're successful, I get a reverse shell that I can do some damage with, and I will. So I am going to switch to this view. So over here, this black window, if you can see it, this represents the victim's vulnerable machine. It's running nginx 1.4. And this red window is the attacker's machine. I am the attacker. So let's just verify that this works. I've named the black window, the victim's machine, v-nginx. So if I can just curl v-nginx, I get a beautiful web page back. It's being served by nginx 1.4.0, and it even has a header that says, "This is my beautiful web page." So now let me start a blind attack against the nginx. All right, so first I'm going to verify that it's vulnerable. I'm just going to blast an overflow of like 5,000 characters, and if it crashes, then I know I'm able to overflow the stack. So you can see that over here, it crashed. So now I'm going to continue. I don't necessarily know the overflow length, but I'm going to try overflows of various lengths until I get a crash. So I found that I can overflow with a length of 4,112, and that's what the crash is. And I'm going to assume that I crashed because I clobbered the stack canary. And I'm going to go into very low level detail about all these things. So if you don't get it right off the bat, I will definitely circle around. And so we're going to do that by reading 1 byte at a time. Now I've got 4 bytes of the canary. I'm on the 5th, the 6th, the 7th. There's the 8th byte of the canary. Now I know what the canary value is. And now I can build an overwrite, a buffer overrun that includes the correct stack canary, which will prevent the nginx from crashing. Now I need to find the PLT and the stop gadget, and I will get into all kinds of detail what's going on there. But we're basically just scanning through the executable code, looking for where the PLT starts. And there it is at 405.210. Now I need to confirm the actual slot where the return address is. So I'm going to try a few things. There we go. It's at offset 6. I'm going to find this gadget called the BROP gadget, which will let me set the first 2 parameters to any function I want to call. And now I'm going to find strcomp, and that's going to help me pass a 3rd argument to functions that need 3 arguments. And I'm going to do that by scanning through the PLT. Now I found it at index 42. I'm going to find write also by scanning through the PLT. I'm also going to scan what is the file descriptor that nginx is using to send its responses. And hint, it's probably 3. As you know, stood in, stood out, stood error are 0, 1, 2. So it probably created one with the next number, which was 3. And indeed, we found write at index 208, file descriptor 3. We're going to need to dupe that. Now that we can dupe and write, I can actually write the binary from the victim's machine to my machine. So now I have the binary in memory locally, and I can parse through all the well-known ELF structures, and I can find everything else I need to build the attack. So read, usleep, execve, dupe2, and a writable location, because I'm going to write some data into nginx's memory space. And now I have enough to do the final ROP attack and get a reverse shell. So this has been successful. It is pwned. I can cat, etc. password, the canonical way to tell you that I'm on the victim's machine here. I can even cd to the HTML directory and cat index HTML. So there's my beautiful web page, and wouldn't it be a shame if some bad guy came along and said, you've been pwned to index.html. Exit. So now I'm out of my reverse shell, and the next person that comes along and curl and gets your web page is going to find that your web page has been defaced. So that is a successful attack against nginx. So now let's talk in more detail about how this works. So the first step was to find the overflow length. Actually, let me go back and start this again. And I'm going to put some space in here. So we're basically going to start, just for demo purposes, I started at somewhere in the 3,000 range, and I'm going to find the overflow length at 4,112. I'm going to use the term blindish at several points during this talk. This is one of those points where you can be less totally blind, more blindish. The source code is available for nginx, and if you know there's a buffer overrun vulnerability and where it is, you can go, hey, I can see that this buffer is 4,096 bytes long, and that might have been a good initial guess. It'll get you the answer you want quicker. It's just an optimization. But you'll notice that after we have overrun the buffer and crashed, it's because we've overwritten the stack canary, and that's what this stack smashing detected error is. This is from the C runtime. So now we're going to find the canary. Let me go back to my slide deck. So now we found the overflow length, and now we know the location of the stack canary. So first of all, what is a stack canary? So if you think about this is your stack, your buffer and local variables. Immediately after that, the compiler places a stack canary, which is a random value. In the prologue to this function, this canary value will be set to the known canary value. At the epilogue of this function, it will check to see whether the value in this canary slot is still what it should be. And if it's not, it'll assume you've had a buffer overrun. Either you have a bug or you're being attacked, like in this case. So if you overrun past this buffer and local variables, you will necessarily overrun and overwrite the canary as well. So if you clobber the canary, your program is going to fail. So we need to figure out what the canary is. So our procedure is we're going to overwrite 1 byte past the end of the buffer into this slot that I've denoted as S, and I'm going to try the value 0. I'm not going to overwrite the remaining 7 bytes of the canary. I'm going to leave them unclobbered. I'm only going to overwrite S, and I'm going to try 0. And if it crashes, I'm going to try 1. I'm going to try 2, 3, 4, 5, all the way up to 255 until I find something that doesn't crash. So let's see what that looks like. As luck would have it, the first byte of a stack canary is by design always 0. So we're always going to get the first one on the first try. So yay us. So now we know the first byte of the canary at 0. I'm going to move on to the next slot, the next byte, which I denoted by T. And I'm going to put 0 in there. Well, that wasn't the right guess. So I'm going to guess 1. And that wasn't the right guess. I'm going to guess 2. That wasn't. And 3 and 4 and so on and so forth until I hit F5 in my example here. And that was the correct guess. No crash. And I got to do the same for U. I move on to U over here. I try 0, 1, 2, 3, up to 255 until I guess the correct value. Keep doing that for the rest of the canary. And now you know the canary. As I said, The first byte is always 0. That's by design. So you only have to guess 7 on average. Half the values are above 128 and half the values are below 128. So you have to guess 7 of them. So 7 times 128 is on average about 900 attempts before you guess the right canary. So now I know the canary value. And let me run that there. So, we're just going to go byte by byte until we figure out the right values for each byte of the canary. And then we're just going to re-verify, try the whole overflow again with the correct canary, no crash, we move on. And now we need to find the PLT and the stop gadget. So what is the PLT? I have a link at the end, and I'll make sure that I provide the slides to you guys. I have a link at the end, but basically it is the procedure linkage table. And when your program calls printf, well, printf is in libc, which is a shared object that gets loaded in at load time. Your program doesn't know ahead of time where printf is in memory. So what it does is, in all the calls to printf in your program don't go directly to libc. They go to a section in your code called the PLT, which is a vector of jump trampolines that jump to the actual address that the loader has put in a memory slot that takes you to printf. So you call to printf in your PLT and it jumps to printf in glibc. Here's an example of what a PLT looks like, or at least a snippet of it. So here's printf down here. So when you see a call to printf in your program, it's actually a call to 405.260, and the first thing it does is jump to this indirect address, which the loader will set up for you, and it'll contain the address of printf in libc. And I'm not going to go over what the rest of this does. I encourage you to go see the link that I provide, or do a good Google search. But this thing there's an array of these things, and it's pretty easy to identify these things too. They're always at 16-byte aligned boundaries, and they're all fairly conveniently located at the start of the executable. And before I leave this slide, I want to point out that newer Linux kernels use a different format for the PLT. You won't see this exact format, but everything I say about this PLT also applies to that PLT. They're all 16-byte aligned. They're all at the beginning of the program. They're all really easy to identify. So it's quick. It's near the beginning of the binary. That's pretty helpful. You can start them. They always start on a 16-byte boundary, so you don't have to look 1 byte at a time. You can look 16 bytes at a time. And they're all 16 bytes long. The important thing about what's in the PLT is, let me go back to my example. Most of these wrap system calls. What that means is, excuse me, if you invoke them via ROP without setting up any the good arguments or anything like that, garbage for arguments, they won't crash. They may return an error code. They won't work, but they won't crash either. So if you execute this, it won't crash. It'll just return an error code. If you execute chmod, it won't crash. It'll just return an error code. So and again, you can be blindish here too. You can start at the very beginning of the ELF executable, or you can take an educated guess by looking at a local copy of where you think it approximately starts. Again, it's just an optimization that will get you to the PLT quicker. So the start of a procedure to find the PLT is find a 16-byte aligned address near the beginning of your program and ROP to it. And if it crashes, well, that's not the right guess. So move on to the next 16-byte aligned address and ROP to that. Eventually, if you get to a 16-byte aligned address that doesn't crash, you can verify or confirm that it's the PLT by trying the next sequential 16-byte aligned address. And if that doesn't crash either, then you've got two things in a row that when you ROP to them, they didn't crash. There's a good bet that you have found the PLT using a blind ROP technique when you can find two things that don't crash. Now, this is an incomplete procedure. So let's let's address the two remaining problems or two missing elements from this procedure. One of it is, so what we know right now is we know how much of the buffer and locals we need to overwrite. We can overwrite with the canary, and we can overwrite the rest of the stack with our PLT guess. But we don't know exactly which of these slots is the return address. So that's not a problem for now. There may be saved registers, not the return address, but a saved register here at n+2 and n+3. So that's okay. Instead of just putting our PLT guess at n+2, let's just flood the stack with, say, 10 of the same address. One of these is going to be the return address. There's the register save area is probably maximum 6 entries big. So one of those is going to be the return address. So we don't necessarily have to know at this point the exact slot that the return address is in, as long as we flood it with enough that we know we're going to reliably hit the return address. Now, there's another problem, is even if we guess correctly that this is the address of the PLT, the base of the PLT, well, we're going to ROP to this, and it's going to return, and it's going to return and to this, and it's going to return to this, and return to this. It's going to slide all the way down. When we hit the end of our flood of PLT addresses, there's going to be some random entry on the stack here, and we're going to crash. So the procedure here, the full procedure here is to try our 16-byte aligned addresses, and also try flooding various depths to various depths in order to form what's called a stop gadget. Now, a stop gadget is a ROP chain that we know, when it's well formed, will not crash the program. Remember, we're using no crash signals to learn about what's going on. So, we need to engineer a gadget so that it doesn't always crash. So the way we do that is, well, nginx is a server, and it has this pattern like all servers do. At the beginning, at the bottom of its thread is a request loop. So it's just an infinite loop. Wait for a request, handle the request, go back, wait for another request, handle that request, ad infinitum. And I want to note that this is not actually nginx's event loop, but it's the exact same pattern. So what we want to do is engineer a ROP chain that has a PLT slide, and assuming it's the correct address of the PLT, we will slide all the way down to the depth. And when we slide off the end of our PLT slide, we land in the request loop and don't crash. So that's what this phase of the attack is doing, is trying sequential 16-byte aligned addresses with various depths to flood the stack with that address attempt. And we find that at address 210, we found two subsequent entries that didn't crash. And we found that if we flood that entry up to 40, it will land us back in the request loop, and we have our stop gadget 2. So here's where we are. So we are flooding our PLT guesses immediately after the canary, but as I said, we don't know which one of these is exactly where the return address is. So how do we find that? Well, let's try n+2, which is the slot immediately after the canary. I'm going to write a value there that is known. If you execute that value, it's going to crash. I wrote a little bomb there. It's best to think of it as a landmine, and if you step on that landmine, it will blow up. So Say I tried n+2, I sent this request, but I didn't get a crash. Well, then I know that this is not the return address. So we try n+3, put a landmine there. If the landmine doesn't go off, that's not the return address. We try n+4, no crash. Finally, we try, in this example, n+5, and it crashed. That means that n+5 must be the return address slot. So that's this phase. We're laying all our landmines until we find one that actually goes off. So in this example, it's at offset 6. It's a little different from my slides, but it doesn't really matter. So let's review where we are so far, because there's been a lot going on. We are now able to send simple ROP chains that don't crash the server. I'm going to overwrite my buffer and locals. I'm going to set the proper canary value. I don't really care what goes in here. My ROP chain starts at n+5. That's the first return address. And this simple ROP chain is 6 elements big. When we run off the end of our ROP chain, we slide into our PLT slide all the way down to the request loop, no crash. So we've made a lot of progress so far, but we can't actually do anything until we can control registers. So that's the next step, is to find something called the BROP gadget, or BROP gadget. And that's something that lets us control the first 2 arguments to any function. So all of what I'm talking about is very specific to x86 64-bit. So as you may or may not know, the first argument to any function in that architecture is passed in the RDI register. The second one is passed in RSI. Now there's this gadget, which I have here, called the BROP gadget, which is a gift from the gods. It is available in pretty much every ELF binary for x86 64. Any program of any appreciable size is going to have this gadget, because what this is the epilogue to a function that uses all the non-volatile registers. So at the top of the function, if it's going to use any of these registers, it needs to save them. There's going to be pushes. And at the bottom, they need to be restored. These are the pops. So this is what lets us control the first 2 registers. Now, before I tell you about where RDI and RSI are, how do we identify and find this gadget? I don't think I have a slide, a picture of that, but if I ROP to this address, 40767D in my example, and I place 6 landmines on the stack, well, this gadget will pop off all the landmines and I won't crash. If it's not this gadget, if I landed, above here, it would not pop 6 things from the stack. It wouldn't be my gadget. So it's fairly easy to locate this by pushing 6 time bombs on the stack, executing your candidate address, and if it pops all your time bombs off, then you found the gadget. So now you're probably wondering, where's RSI and RDI in this? So let's examine this last instruction, pop R15. This is at address 407685. If I skip past this 41 to address 407686, this is what it looks like. At address 407686, that instruction turns into pop RDI followed by a ret. So I have the first argument to any function by just jumping into the middle of the pop R15 instruction. And similarly, if you look at this pop R14 right above it, it's at 683. But if I actually misparse it, starting at 684, that pop R15 becomes pop RSI. And it also is followed by pop R15. So now I control RSI and RDI, which are the first 2, RDI and RSI, which are the first 2 arguments to any function. And the only weirdness, and it's not a problem at all, is the RSI gadget. You need to account for the fact that there's a second pop. So you need to put something for it to pop off in your ROP chain. So that's it. Now I have the first two arguments to any function, and I'm scanning through, and I said it's very common. It's a gift from the gods. You can find it in no time flat. So there I have it. So now I found the PLT. I need to find stir compare. So, I mean, I should back up. What I really need to find is something to control the third argument to any function on x86-64, which is in the RDX register. Now, the problem is RDX is a volatile register. It's a scratch register. You are never going to find a push RDX or a pop RDX. There's just no reason to ever save this and restore it on the stack because it's a scratch register. But some person way cleverer than me found that the stir compare function uses RDX as a scratch register and just leaves a value in RDX that is known to be non-zero. I believe it's actually the length of the second argument. And the point is, all we care about is that it's a non-zero value. So we're going to use stir compare to sort of control the third argument to any function that requires a third argument. Usually those are lengths. So again, as long as it's a non-zero length, then that's probably good enough for us. So how do you find stir compare? Well, you scan through each PLT trampoline stub and you call, whatever address this is, and you pass. Now that we control the first two arguments, we can pass two good addresses or one or both as bad addresses. If you pass two good addresses, it won't crash. And if you do any of the other combinations, you'll crash. So a good candidate for the good address is hex 400,000, which is the start of an ELF binary. And a bad address can be anything that's really bad, like 5 would be a bad address. So I'm going to scan through the PLT. I'm running each of those 4 tests on each entry that I find. I found stir compare at index 42. So now I control 3 arguments. I can call functions that take 3 arguments. So now I need to find right. And I need to find right because the next phase of my attack, I'm going to attempt to write the binary, the actual nginx binary from the victim system to my system. And then I can inspect it at my leisure and find out even more information just by parsing the ELF file. So I need to find right. We need to scan through the PLT to find it. And I also need to find out what file descriptor nginx is using internally to send its responses. And here's another blindish optimization you can make. It's probably 3. As you know, 0, 1, and 2, standard in, standard out, standard error. If you ask for another file descriptor, it'll get the next one. It's probably going to be 3, but we will make a good faith guess. We'll try values from 3 to 10. You could try values from 3 to 50. So that's what we do. We go through, we scan through the PLT, and the first argument to what we're going to guess is right, we're going to try 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 until we find something that works. We're going to try and write the base address of the executable, which is hex 400,000 with some length that's hopefully greater than 4. And the test is, if we can receive back, if we can successfully call write with this address, we should be able to receive back the ELF header. Every ELF program starts with the characters hex 7F ELF, 7F ELF. And if we find that, if we can receive that back, we found right. So that's what we're doing here. We're going through every entry in the PLT. I think we're not going to find it until 208 or so. And we're going to try all the combinations with every file descriptor. And eventually we're going to find it. I believe it was at 208 and file descriptor 3. And now I don't have a slide, but we're going to find dupe 2 as well in a very similar way with a PLT scan. And we found it almost instantly at offset 5. And now we have the components of our very first ROP chain. We're going to ROP this thing and download the binary. So actually, I can just continue here. So that was pretty quick. We just piecewise called write until we received the entire binary. And now we have the entire binary of nginx in memory. We can use well-known ELF parsing techniques, and I can find everything else I need to perform the attack. I'm going to need read, usleep, execve, dupe2 we already found. And I'm also going to need a writable location because we're going to write some data into nginx's address space. And I'll have a slide for this, finding good RDX. Let me explain that here. We're going to try and execute a reverse shell, and this is our shell /bin/sh with a null terminator. That is 8 bytes long. So remember, we're using strcomp to sort of control RDX. We need to find an address such that when we call strcomp on it, it leaves RDX set to a value that's at least 8. So we can scan through addresses in our code segment and call strcomp on that candidate address. We're going to write the contents of that address and try to receive it back in my Ruby program. And if I receive back at least 8 bytes, that's a good address to call strcompare on during the last part of the attack. All right, and here's the final ROP attack. Let me just go back here. What we're going to send over in the final payload, we're going to take over the victim's stood in, stood out, and stood error by duping it to the file descriptor we created. And this writable location, we're going to write out the current contents back to my Ruby and try and receive it. Then we're going to sleep for 2 seconds. Could be 3 seconds, but 2 seconds is enough. While nginx is sleeping, my Ruby program is going to send this string. Now, when nginx wakes up from its sleep, it's going to read what we transmitted /bin/sh into the writable location we found in the ELF file. And we're going to write the location back to us and verify that it contains the string /bin/sh. But nginx isn't going to wait for that either. It's just going to exec it right away. So now this is what lets us exec and run and get to our reverse shell. So let me just run that over here. So we've done the write and the sleep and the read and the write, and finally the exec, and I've already showed you the rest of this. Password, I'm in. So, sorry, that took 3,858 requests. On average, I've done this demo lots of times. It takes about 4,000 requests to successfully attack using Blind ROP. And again, using a blindish approach, you can maybe optimize that, maybe shave off 1,000. But it just depends on how lucky you are. You may have been wondering all through this, what about ASLR? You no doubt saw in several cases, I hard-coded the value hex 400,000, which is the default load location for every ELF executable without ASLR, address space layout randomization. So what I just demoed to you did not have ASLR, but if you think about it, it's not a huge problem for Blind ROP to deal with. It does complicate things, but if you remember how we read the canary value 1 byte at a time, well, we could just keep doing that. Read the next 8 bytes, and read the next 8 bytes until we hit the return address. And as you probably know, to defeat ASLR, all you have to do is leak a single pointer into your address space, and the return address is a pointer into your address space. Once you've leaked that, now you know where the executable starts. It's not 400,000, it's somewhere else. But just replace everywhere previously in my slide deck where you saw 400,000 with the actual value that you discovered by defeating ASLR. So not a problem. Now, if it seems fragile to you, it is. Actually, I did this work when I first joined Polyverse. I started with the Ruby program written by the guys in the original paper, and it didn't work. And it took me weeks to get it to work again. So, you know, a lot of things can go wrong. A lot of things can just make it, just stop it, or make it untenably difficult to attack a program. One of them that I've discovered, I've actually tried to recreate, as I said, nginx has fixed these vulnerabilities. I've tried to recreate this blind attack in the latest nginx by introducing an error where one doesn't exist. I've introduced my own, and I couldn't get it to work. And the reason I couldn't get it to work is because I'm clobbering the non-volatile register save area. So if you think about that, I'm clobbering, let's just say R14. So when we do our PLT slide down into our request loop, if that request loop is going to access R15 or R14, I think I said, and it's been clobbered or not restored properly, it's not going to work. It's going to crash. Now I don't have a stop gadget. I'm dead in the water. So I've had that issue. The PLT can contain landmines. So we're scanning through the PLT one entry at a time. Well, what if I land on something that blocks, doesn't let me make any further progress? Now I've hung nginx, I'm dead. And as you've seen, there's a lot of stuff I showed you, like that BROP gadget that's very x86 64 specific. You know, misparsing a instruction, jumping into the middle of it, and all that stuff is something that you can't do in some other architectures. So finding register setting gadgets in other architectures is going to be more difficult. It's almost certainly not impossible. It probably can be done blind, but you know, I don't know exactly how I would do that. And then this is pretty scary. So you might wonder, how can we defeat a blind ROP attack? Well, Intel's latest chips have something called CET, control flow enforcement technology. And one of the big components of that technology is a shadow stack. So without a shadow stack, your return address is stored on the main stack, which you can overwrite and control it, which I've been doing in this attack. A shadow stack stores the return address in a separate stack. So you can overwrite the main stack, but the CPU will take as the source of truth the return address that's in the shadow stack. And I think there's some setting that if they don't match, it will crash, or it could just take the shadow stack as the source of truth and keep running, you know, whatever. I don't think it matters, but it prevents this kind of, actually it stops all forms of return-oriented program by using a shadow stack. You can also make it more difficult. In this demo, I have demoed one instance of nginx with one worker process. But if you had nginx behind a load balancer, such that I was bouncing between machines, well, what I learned from about one machine is not going to be valid on the next machine. If you think the canary value, across machines, the processes are going to have different canary values. And I'm not going to be able to guess the canary value if you're load balancing me among many instances. I'm also doing just request after request after request after request, and this could very easily set off a throttling procedure on a well administered server. It could start doing exponential backoffs and make this take so long that it's now untenable, or it could just cut me off and say, you've done 1,000 requests, that's enough for you. Lots of ways throttling can ruin this. And as you can probably guess, it is not a stealthy attack at all. All these crashes are going to show up in logs. They're going to potentially send alerts to administrators, something bad is happening. So an administrator can, well, moving down to the next last bullet here, 4,000 requests. If it takes 4,000 requests at 2 seconds per request, that's 2 hours. So that's time enough for a human to get involved and say, hey, we're under attack. Let's take steps. Let's shut off, the attacker's IP address, or bring the server down, or something, some emergency procedure to shut it off in the middle. That can be automated too. So, there's the lack of stealth. Like you can cover your tracks. So one thing you can do is include in your final ROP chain a call to ftruncate64 on the log file, and I'll just truncate your log file, so then you've removed all trace of what's happening. But it's still going to take you 4,000 requests, and there's still plenty of opportunity for your attack to be stopped in the middle before it can complete. And so these are the links. So the first one is by far the most important. That's as I said, all kudos and imagination and brilliance goes to these folks and this paper. I have also written up exactly what I've just presented to you in a blog post that's hosted on Polyverse's blog, and a white paper which goes into the same level, maybe even a little more detail as what I've gone over with you in this talk too. So if you want to follow up on this, I highly recommend these two resources. And finally, I talked a lot about the PLT, and I tried to give a brief overview on what it is, but everything I learned about the PLT, I learned from starting with this example. So I recommend, if you're interested, you can go to that example or that link, and it's a good explanation of what a PLT is and does. And that is it. I'm open for Q&A.
All righty, let me pull up the Q&A. That was a great talk, Don. Thank you for that.
Thank you.
So right now it doesn't look like we have any questions, but I'll start us off. So what are some implications of this paper? What are some future improvements or future explorations you plan on taking with this?
Yeah, so I mentioned Intel CET and the shadow stack. We actually have a software shadow stack that we have that protects nginx in particular. So you can do it in software. As hardware, obviously, it's going to be a bit slower, and you're going to take a bit of a perf hit if you do it in software. But if you're subject to a blind attack, then it helps. And we also have some other technologies. We actually, as you've heard, the PLT plays a huge role in this attack. So we actually also have a technology that hardens the PLT and makes it more difficult to use entries in the PLT as gadgets. So that's another line of defense. The stack canary, I didn't mention it. The reason you can attack the stack canary is because on Linux and Unixes in general, server processes are launched using fork. In other words, they make a copy of their parent process. If we crash the child process, it just forks off a new copy, and it keeps the same canary value across processes, across child processes. So if you can randomize the canary across child processes, that's another way to harden the canary by quite a bit. Then you can't guess the canary value, and you get stopped like almost at the beginning of this attack. So those are three ways that you can subvert this attack, and we've actually written all three of the ways that I've just described.
Gotcha. Okay. Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you.
Right now, you must